So I finally got my fix of KFC in quarantine.
Team Red,
But they didn't give me any spoon, so I have to drink my mashed potato.
Team Green.
Go green, go green. Now, there is a growing online voice in social media, mainly the hellscape known as Malaysian Twitter, that says that we should not blame West Malaysia or Malaya for the ever growing income inequality between East and West Malaysia. They also say that year in and year out, we as East Malaysians only have ourselves to be blamed for voting the politicians who enforce the status quo. It happened in the recent Sabah elections, the 2020 Sabah elections, but it's also been a common theme that repeats itself over and over again, as if Malaysia is an entertainment franchise that they keep recycling themes. I probably need to check if J.J. Abrams and the Disney Corporation is behind the Malaysian constitution in the first place. Now, I say that this is a very troubling development in the discourse of growing inequality between East and West Malaysia. Now, this is disappointing, mainly because, number one, most of these arguments are made on the liberal side of Twitter and Facebook. As much as you want to assume that Facebook is liberal in some sense. Number two, most of the people who make these arguments sound reasonably educated. But number three, these arguments are mainly made by people who are aware of discrimination, well, mainly the liberal crowd and so on, racial otherwise, those kinds of discrimination. But yet, at the very same time, they can sound quite classist. So when they tell me to stop blaming Malaya for a lot of the problems in East and West Malaysia, I do raise some eyebrows. In this video, I will be debunking several components of this claim, and I'm going to divide them into three different parts. First of all, they say that we keep voting for the same people. Number two, they say that, well, we have a clear alternative to the ruling coalition. And number three, and I think this is the most common thing that people like to point out, is that we already have autonomy anyway, so why do you keep blaming Malaya? Part 1. We keep voting in the same people. It's kind of weird that I think that Malaya is blameless in this sense because you have to ask yourself first, who exactly empowers the political parties in East Malaysia? We're talking about political parties like GPS, which is Gabungan Parti Sarawak, or the former Sarawakian Barisan Nasional and the current Sabahan Barisan Nasional. At the end of the day, it's mainly political parties from Malaya who do view them as allies in the first place. And the narratives that they share are sort of similar. So they create this some kind of false consciousness. And what I mean here is that it creates this form of artificial bond between the Malays in West Malaysia and also the Bumiputras in East Malaysia in some sense. And you have to understand that most of the people who vote for Barisan Nasional or GPS at the end of the day are mainly rural areas. Because these are the people who create the environment thinking that they are the only ones who could shield the rural populace from the ever-growing fear of competition from whoever it is. They're the ones who tell the rural poor that GPS and BN are the ones who could protect them. So this is a huge issue when it comes to false consciousness because instead of relating to the very same other people who might come from another working class background, they view themselves as if they could associate themselves with the ruling elite who are empowered by West Malaysian parties in the first place. But let's put it aside. Let's put aside all these rural voters at the end of the day. Almost every single city in Sarawak or Sabah, we're talking about places like Kuching, Sibu, or in the case of Sabah, we can talk about Kota Kinabalu and so on. They're all led by DAP, or at least they have a huge influence when it comes to PKR. But of course, in the case of Malaysia, winning seats in the cities is practically meaningless because our right to vote for municipal council has been suspended for ages now. I'm not so sure how many years, but the point is that We recently had this debacle at the beginning of the year, having our Minister for Local Authority and so on who wanted to push for city council elections, but that also didn't go through. So I guess we could blame West Malaysia for that too, because she came from West Malaysia. So even in the case of Sarawak, our Minister for Local Authority is Sim Kui Huan from SUPP, and he is a member of the GPS coalition. His political party is part of that. And a huge majority of citizens actually did vote for Pakatan Harapan. I mean, Pakatan Harapan did actually get the popular vote in the first place, as much as I think Pakatan Harapan is an imperfect choice. But this is where West Malaysia, they don't really understand that we still have the rural weightage, and I'm not so sure if there is active gerrymandering. I don't want to make the claim about that here, but conveniently enough, we have really large constituencies with small number of voters. And these constituencies outnumber the urban areas. And we inherited the first past the post system from the British. And that's the election system that we've learned from them. So the result is that our elections are never proportionate to the number of voters that we have. Now, we were given the opportunity to solve this problem in 2018 when we had Pakatan Harapan getting into government. We could have solved this if SPR, basically our election commission, took the active steps in redrawing the districts or redrawing the constituencies. But we did not see that happen. Instead, the former head of SPR became the Speaker of the House under this new Perikatan government instead. So we missed that opportunity. So in that sense, who is it supposed to be blamed when it comes to having the politicians that you say that we have been keeping, voting in? Like, we did have a change when it comes to the popular vote, and most cities actually voted against the ruling coalition. So you can't really blame us in that sense when the game is already rigged in the first place. And you can't expect us to suddenly change this rigged game. We are going up against, the odds are against us.
Part 2. We have a clear alternative to the ruling coalition.
I think this is like a huge chunk of this video in general. And this would basically question a lot of assumptions people have made about East Malaysia. The assumption that West Malaysia have is that, we have a clear alternative to the ruling coalition. Of course, in the case of in the case of West Malaysia, their choice is between Pakatan Harapan, and back then they had Bersatu too, versus a nationalistic coalition instead. So that is the binary that exists between the two in West Malaysia. But we have a bit of a problem in East Malaysia because the lines could be blurred. The problem here is that the only opposition party that is based in East Malaysia is actually Warisan. And even then, they're primarily based in Sabah. They're not in Sarawak. So Shafi Abdal and the gang, they're only in one state, not in the rest of Sarawak. But here's the thing that West Malaysians need to understand. Two characteristics that they need to understand about the East Malaysian demographics. They have to understand the existence of nationalists, but I'll explain in a bit how is it different from West Malaysian nationalists. And number two, I'm going to talk about the rural poor. Let's talk about the first one, how about these nationalists. Now, the thing about nationalism is that, I might have complained about them in previous videos, like in Muda, when I spoke a bit about at least they're a slightly better alternative to UMNO instead. I don't think nationalism is inherently bad. What I mean here is that nationalism, when used as an external pressure, it's sort of good. Like, for example, when you're fighting against multinational corporations or MNCs who are taking away land, or at least monopolize a lot of this land and consider them as private property, or they monopolize local industries that basically kills off quite a lot of local businesses. Or you could also say that nationalism used an external pressure is kind of good when you are able to rally people against colonialism. Now, these are all useful tools. But My disagreement comes in when it's used as an internal pressure that seeks to gatekeep whoever is in the in group, like who exactly is the true Malaysian. So this is where lines get blurred, or not having a diverse range of choices of how society needs to be represented. So this is where stuff like you have to be fluent in Malay, you need to speak Malay in a certain way, or else you are not considered as Malaysian enough, and somehow your Malay is broken and you should not be considered as Malaysian, and people question your Malaysianness. Now, the thing about Sabah and Sarawak, they have a lot of nationalist sentiments, but they're slightly different from what it is in West Malaysia. We're not talking about the same form of nationalist sentiments that UMNO or Bersatu has in some sense. So a lot of East Malaysian narratives have been underplayed. So when your alternatives are parties based in West Malaysia, like DAP and PKR and so on, it makes people question who is in control here. There is a reason why DAP in the recent Sabah elections decided to ride on the wave of Warisan, because they know that they are perceived as the foreigners. And the fight between Warisan and Barisan Nasional, led by Bung Mokhtar and the gang, was basically a fight of who is the more nationalist party that is able to take care of the people in the state of Sabah and prioritize Sabahan issues in the first place. So there's this huge question that people have, and DAP is trying to hide behind Warisan. The question that people have is that who exactly calls the shots if DAP were to win bigger seats or a bigger margin in elections. Now, in the case of Sarawak, we don't have Warisan, but we do have a ruling coalition that tries to play off all of these nationalist sentiments. So, while the irony is that Gabungan Party Sarawak, which basically consists of the remnants of former Sarawak BN in general, work closely with Perikatan Nasional, at the very least, they managed to win the narrative that they are able to claim to cater to local interests first. That is their main priority. They think that they could protect local businesses, and they started stuff like TV Sarawak, and they offered to start Sarawak's own telco company. I don't know the details of that, but all of this is sort of like a form of virtue signaling that tells people who fear a lot of competition from West Malaysia that, you know, these political parties, the alternatives, DAP and so on, will not benefit their economic interests. So this is where we lead to the second issue of demographics, is the rural poor, and we're going to talk a bit about the false consciousness that I explained in the first argument earlier. Now, while I spoke about false consciousness with the Bumiputra elite that I mentioned earlier, and I can understand the comfort it brings, you're not thinking about, this person looks like me, or this person speaks the same language as me. If you have somebody who is Iban, part of the Bumiputra elite, they might assume that if you question his abilities, you are then questioning the ability of the Iban community. Do you hate other Iban people or something along those lines? I'm pretty sure the Malay community have heard something similar before. Now, all of this creates this comforting feeling, thinking that, you have something similar to the rest of the, Iban elite and someone versus the other. And when you fear the other is that they are the direct competition. And I guess in this scenario, the ruling coalition and the ruling elite are able to say that the other at this point is basically West Malaysia in comparison. So there's a reason why in Sarawak, or at least in the formation, at least during the formation of Malaysia, I'm going to prioritize Sarawak because that's where I spend a huge chunk of my life in, to be honest. It was important for the locals to demand autonomy for our immigration in the first place. So there are great fears that, if we were to form Malaysia and there is like free movement of labor and so on, well, to be honest, I'm sort of for it. If there are adequate affirmative action policies to help Borneoization and somehow the interests of local parties or the welfare of the indigenous people are met in the first place. But the point is that in the case of Sarawak, quite a number of people sort of question what would happen if you do have that free movement of labor. So what happened here is that Sarawak was given some kind of autonomy for immigration. And the fear is that if there is a free movement of labor, that would lead to some kind of a population boom. And a population boom from the influx of people from West Malaysia, and most of them are Malays, versus the locals who are mainly indigenous people who believe in indigenous folk religions, who don't see the same kind of affinity to the same degree as towards West Malaysia and so on. And there's this odd position where West Malaysia is used as the boogeyman on who would influence local politics, considering the fact quite a number of them believe in Christianity and so on, despite working with them and defending them as the other instead. So the fear is that if there is this huge population boom from that side of the world coming into the state, they would be the ones who control the economy, because there is a huge disparity between the two regions in the first place. So West Malaysia was developed at a faster rate by the British. Well, not because the British were kind and so on. It was mainly because of resource extraction. Like when it comes to resource extraction, Malaysia was a bit later. East Malaysia was a bit later in that sense, because the oil boom only happened at a later date, and before that, East Malaysia, or at least Sarawak itself, was under control under the Brooke administration, and only later on, towards the twilight years of the Brooke administration after World War II, that the British government, or at least the British imperial government, took over and treated us as a colony instead. But the point is that West Malaysia developed faster, so which meant that quite a number of West Malaysians were way more privileged, economically privileged. And the fear was that they will be the ones who are able to buy up property, they will be the ones who will be able to invest in more businesses before East Malaysians were able to do in the first place. And that's sort of like the side effect of the hunger that the British have for Malaya's resources in the first place. Now, not only that, to many people in Sarawak in general, scandals on a federal level is a whole alien idea to them. I mean, there is some kind of affinity that people have because everybody reads the same kind of news and so on. Everybody goes on Twitter and doom scroll through threats that will never resolve the urban-rural divide and so on. But the point is that we've had leaders in Sarawak who are able to navigate whatever scandals that the former Prime Minister Najib Razak had. He managed to frame it in a way where 1MDB is considered alien to them. It's not a problem. And a lot of Sarawakians buy into that rhetoric. So that is the reason why people like Adnan Satem, RIP, the former chief minister, was sort of popular. He managed to position himself in a way where the former Prime Minister Najib's problems aren't exactly our problems as a state. They viewed West Malaysia as a different entity. And I don't necessarily agree with a lot of this, that somehow it's a problem in the other state, like another whole area, because to be honest, our taxpayers' money also sort of like get implicated through whatever corruption scandal that happens in West Malaysia and so on. But they created this divide between the two. And this is where a lot of people buy into that form of rhetoric. So while you may have urban areas who are hyper online, like for example in Kuching, they may view some kind of affinity with people in West Malaysia. Quite a number of people in Kuching actually work in KL or study in KL because they are the ones who are way more privileged in comparison to people in rural areas. So they do view those kind of links. But people in rural areas, or at the very least when it comes to the Bumiputra community, they view that as a whole different thing that you can deal. As long as Sarawak gets the funds it needs to develop, then that's okay. We can push forward instead. Now, the problem is that our opposition never provided an alternative to the wave of nationalism that sort of exists. And when you create that barrier and said that, the problems in West Malaysia is a whole different thing, nothing to do with us. It's easy for them to say that, well, we're scandal free, we can continue to work within that. Well, I don't think that's the reality because they are still under the Barisan Nasional banner. So when you have this nationalist saying that, well, if you fear competition, you then have to vote for us. Fear competition from West Malaysia, and the problems in West Malaysia are not our problem. And what is DAP going to do? DAP still works as if that it's not them who are calling the shots. Like, you may have DAP Sarawak, but people are going to remember DAP first before the Sarawak part of the party. So you don't have a local opposition that creates these comforting tales for a lot of people who think that they suddenly have to compete against corporations that come from West Malaysia instead. Now, I don't agree with most of it, like I said earlier. But if you are a person who fears a lot of this competition, who are you going to vote for? Are you going to vote for the people who seem to be the puppets of West Malaysia? Or are you going to vote for the people who tell all these comforting tales coming from GPS or the former remnants of Barisan Nasional Sarawak? Now, let me divert into something that's a bit more controversial, and this is quite common too. So, a lot of West Malaysians like to paint East Malaysia as people who take cash handouts from Barisan Nasional or whatever gifts that they bring into the long houses. So there's this common joke that when you are close to elections, all of a sudden you see this tong biru, or basically this water tanks that are blue in color. That is the color of the Barisan Nasional previously, before GPS became the ruling coalition in Sarawak. And it's kind of unfair that a lot of West Malaysians say that, the poor rural folks shouldn't accept them or shouldn't receive them, they shouldn't vote for them. I think this is where they don't understand the dynamics when it comes to poverty, or the dynamics when it comes to income inequality in East Malaysia. So the poor in general, let's just try to imagine that you are in their shoes. They care about their immediate survival first. They care about their position first. So instead of shaming the poor, Malaya in general, or at least the political parties who are based in Malaya, should quell the fears about directly competing with people, and they should figure out an alternative to these cash handouts. And it's kind of weird because the world is moving into a world where concepts like universal basic income is slowly getting mainstream acceptance, especially in a post-COVID world. You would have never imagined a country like America, the United States, or even Donald Trump giving out like $2,000 to every single citizen, every adult in America. That is unheard of in the history of the Republican Party. You try to bring that up during the Reagan administration, you will be perceived as a communist. But yet, Trump was able to do that. And I guess in a world where COVID-19 is basically stripping bare the elements of capitalism in our society, I think we should rethink, or at least how Malaya would talk about cash handouts should actually change. So a lot of people suddenly understand the concept of cash handouts or economic stimulus when they are the ones who are going through the lack of economic opportunity. And just like how you saw the Klang Valley going through extreme measures when it comes to having a second lockdown, all of a sudden people are asking these kind of things. They aren't able to actually continue their businesses. All of a sudden they understand the concept of cash handouts, but they can't understand it when it comes to the Sarawakian elections or the Sabahan elections. So the poor there, feeling some kind of gratitude, no matter how you want to talk about the scandals or whatever political ideas that these people may hold. Not only they have that false consciousness, they feel that comfort knowing that somebody give them these cash handouts. So you may disagree with the politics, but cash handouts are quite important to them. So there is no technical, real, viable alternative if somebody gives you cash handouts and the other side says that you are stupid for taking them and you are basically allowing corruption. and your votes are being bought over. Maybe to some extent you could argue that votes are being bought over, but the reality is that people just want to put food on the table. And this is where Malaya or the Klang Valley does not understand the thought process.
Part 3. We already have autonomy.
What else you want to complain about? Like West Malaysian states don't have the same privileges that we do and somehow. But when we talk about autonomy, our autonomy isn't at the same level as what you would imagine the states would have in the United States of America or the specific members of the European Union. We don't have that. The question that becomes who is responsible for a lot of our road and infrastructure at the end of the day? Because according to the Constitution, there are quite a number of stuff that's the priority of the federal government, in which we don't actually have control. So when the federal government is slacking, it would also mean that our infrastructure will be lag behind. And I guess because we don't have the same population, we don't have strong economic centers like Kuala Lumpur and so on, there's less of an incentive for them to develop the interior of Sarawak. So the only parts they would develop are probably places where they could extract resources, which is kind of like how the British tried to extract resources from Malaya in some sense. Even then, let's say that we work in that federal system, and somehow in a federal system we do give out budgets and so on. Whatever it is, you are able to demand budgets and so on. Where do most of these resources go to? Now, I know at one point there's this huge court battle between the GPS government. I'm sorry, I'm using mainly Sarawakian examples. That's mainly what I am more familiar with instead. So this is where GPS have tried to sue Petronas and sue the federal government about certain amendments about several acts related to resources and so on, in order to demand more from Petronas. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not mainly interested about that. I think there is something more sinister in comparison, like even if you were to get money from Petronas and so on. So Petronas may have profited from the labor and resources of Sarawakians in Bintulu and when it comes to Sabahan, I guess Kimanis in some sense. But at the end of the day, despite being a GLC, they are a private corporation. So we may have government representatives in this unique Malaysian form of state capitalism in this board of directors, but how many of people in GLCs actually grew up in the rural areas of Sabah and Sarawak? I'm talking about the people who have control over where the profits actually go to. Now, I'm not so sure about the numbers of people who are able to make these executive decisions. I don't know the details of it, but I'm pretty sure a huge chunk of them are not from Sabah and Sarawak. They're not the majority, simply by statistics and so on. So, because at the end of the day, this is what matters. Who exactly gets to control where the money is at? And it all matters more than having our own immigration system when it comes to autonomy. It's a different story when you say that, maybe Petronas should have been a workers' co-op where the people of Kimanis and Bintulu are able to vote where the profits actually go to. But that's not the reality. We're having MPs who probably have no relation to people in Sarawak and so on, who make these decisions, despite the fact that, people on the ground, the laborers, quite a number of them are actually Sarawakians and mainly come from working class families who work in Bintulu instead. So we don't have the people in Petronas who get to decide where the money actually goes to. But if they were to be in control, you are less likely to see a huge chunk of this money going into KLCC, Kuala Lumpur City Centre, Petronas Twin Towers, and the maintenance of it. But instead, it will mainly go into the communities where these workers are from in the first place. Well, it is the GLC anyway, and the seed capital came from taxpayers. So introducing ideas like workplace democracy in these companies should be in serious consideration. And I think that is where true autonomy actually lies. the ability of the workers to determine where exactly the profit goes. And it's not like there is no precedence. I mean, Felda in the past started as a co-op. I know, unfortunately, it did change into a corporation, and the people in Felda are the ones. A huge chunk of them, maybe you know, blue collar workers and so on, but they don't get to determine where exactly the profit goes to the extent you would imagine how a worker co-op should actually work. And ironically, at the same time, autonomy sort of has like autonomy in the traditional sense as how quite a number of West Malaysians imagine it. It's sort of like exacerbated income inequality by allowing monopolies by corporations owned by or at least affiliated to the people who used to rule the states, especially in the case of Sarawak. I think you know who I'm talking about here in general. And they only seek to enrich the elites, the people I was talking about earlier. And of course, they're propped up by the very same people in Malaya because they view some kind of affinity and they view them as like a counterbalance to the number of Chinese and Indian people in West Malaysia to make sure that they have the ruling majority eventually. But the point is, the monopolies were created because of autonomy, and these monopolies exist in these autonomies because they are the ones who are being propped up by the people in Kuala Lumpur or Putrajaya. Well, basically in the past there was no Putrajaya, but you get my point.
Oh, wow, you are still here? Well, here's the conclusion, I guess.
So the conclusion here is simple. Malaya, please stop saying that it was always our fault. Stop denying that Malaya has not benefited a lot from the suppression of East Malaysian voices. But at the same time, I hear the same rhetoric in other rural or semi-rural areas in West Malaysia. And as a Sarawakian, I honestly think that the Kelantan experience sounds like quite familiar in some sense. So, KLites, I think that's what you call people from Kuala Lumpur, like to paint this picture of the Kelantanese are stupid for voting for PAS and so on, without considering that there used to be strong ethnic tensions. You could probably consider people from Kelantan to be like a whole different ethnic group instead. And they might have some kind of cultural reasons and so on, which I don't totally agree with. But I think these are things that needs to be taken into serious consideration why they would prefer PAS in some sense. So in order for us to fight against that, we need to find tangible alternatives for their lives. And we need to treat them as humans instead of treating them, as, with this whole blanket policy that they are quote unquote stupid instead. At the same time, I do think what the people of Kelantan go through when they work in the Klang Valley isn't as bad as the dehumanization as what East Malaysians go through. It's bad enough we are already seen as the other by the nationalist elements in this country. Remember the whole internal pressure when it comes to nationalism and so on. But it's sadder when it's the educated elite, people within the Klang Valley who grew up there, who had all these privileges, treat us as if we're subhumans when they are the ones who have benefited the most from income inequality in the first place. And I'm sorry, Bangsa Bubble, but Semenanjung privilege is very, very real. Or I guess if you are to include places like Kelantan, the Klang Valley privilege. Now, like I know you people love your performative politics, so the least you could do is to listen to our stories. Probably the first human being to eat mashed potato chopsticks. Kind of works.